In 2015, ExxonMobil, a global oil giant, discovered a massive offshore reserve of 11 billion barrels of oil near Guyana, a small South American nation with a population of just 800,000. This marked a turning point for Guyana, transforming it from one of the region's poorest countries to a rising star on the global economic map. Since oil production began in 2020, Guyana's economy has grown at an astonishing rate. In 2022, the nation's GDP achieved a record-breaking growth of 62.3%. Oil revenues now generate $1 billion annually for the government and are projected to reach $7.5 billion by 2030. At this pace, Guyana's GDP per capita is expected to surpass $190,000, making it the third wealthiest nation in the world by 2040, just behind Luxembourg and Ireland. However, these remarkable figures come with significant challenges. Can Guyana effectively manage this newfound wealth? Critics worry that the country lacks the legal framework and expertise to handle the financial influx from oil. Examples like Venezuela, home to the largest oil reserves in the world, but mired in economic turmoil, serve as cautionary tales that Guyana cannot afford to ignore. Guyana's uncertainty can be summarized in three pressing questions. First, can the nation's democracy and economy navigate the oil boom without falling victim to its pitfalls? Second, can Guyana address ethnic tensions as oil wealth reshapes its social structure? And finally, in the face of climate change, particularly for a vulnerable coastal nation, does continuing oil extraction align with a sustainable future? Let's delve into Guyana's journey to prosperity through oil in today's video. Abundant natural resources are often expected to fuel robust economic growth. However, in many cases, they turn into a double-edged sword. Instead of bringing prosperity, they lead to economic, political, and social crises, a phenomenon known as the resource curse. With its recent discovery of massive oil reserves, Guyana faces the looming risks of this curse as oil revenues begin to flow into its economy. One reason resources become a curse for developing nations is the emergence of the so-called Dutch disease. This economic phenomenon occurs when a resource-rich country, particularly one with abundant oil, experiences a skewed economy. Surging revenues from resources drive up the value of the national currency. However, a stronger domestic currency has a downside. Foreign currencies become weaker in comparison, making non-oil exports, such as agricultural or industrial goods, more expensive than those of competing nations. As a result, non-oil goods lose their competitiveness in global markets. When oil-rich nations focus their economies on exporting a single resource, labor shifts toward the oil industry at the expense of other sectors, stunting their growth. This makes the economy overly dependent on a single resource, leaving it vulnerable to fluctuations in oil prices or eventual resource depletion. Guyana doesn't have to look far to see this curse in action. Its neighbor, Venezuela, offers a stark, cautionary tale. With an almost total dependence on oil, Venezuela suffered economic collapses when oil prices plummeted in the 1980s and 2014, leading to hyperinflation exceeding 65,000% by 2019. Once a wealthy, oil-rich nation, Venezuela has become one of the world's most severe economic crises. Another consequence of the resource curse is the erosion of governance. In developing nations, a lack of legal frameworks and oversight mechanisms often fosters rampant corruption. A direct result of this is a weakened relationship between governments and their citizens. When governments rely heavily on oil revenues, they become less dependent on taxation and, in turn, less accountable to voters. This allows corrupt and unaccountable politicians to flourish, free from the scrutiny that comes with managing public finances transparently. Angola is a prime example. Over 2 decades, Isabel dos Santos, the daughter of the then president, funneled money from the state oil company Sonangol into private accounts, while millions of Angolans lived in poverty. Santos amassed a fortune, driving the nation's economy into crisis. Guyana faces similar risks. The country scores just 40 on the Corruption Perceptions Index, CPI, below the global average of 43. The Economist Intelligence Unit ranks Guyana as a flawed democracy, only slightly above hybrid regimes like El Salvador. With weak political systems and significant corruption, effectively managing oil revenues will be a significant challenge for Guyana. Adding to concerns is the oil deal Guyana signed with ExxonMobil. Under the agreement, Guyana retains only 50% of oil revenues, well below the global average of 75%, typically kept by oil-producing nations. Moreover, Exxon was granted exploration rights over a vast 26,800 square kilometers, 9 times larger than the company's usual concessions in other countries. This raises questions about whether Guyana was pressured into signing a disadvantageous deal. Exxon argues it accepted the risks of operating in a country with limited infrastructure. However, analysts point out that the agreement was signed after the existence of oil had already been confirmed, casting doubts on the Guyanese government's negotiation capabilities. Even if Guyana manages to safeguard its economy and maintain its young democracy, one critical question remains. Can the nation overcome the deep-seated ethnic divisions within its society, especially as oil revenues continue to grow? Guyana's politics have long been deeply polarized along ethnic lines. Afro-Guyanese, 29% of the population, descendants of African slaves, tend to support the A Partnership for National Unity, APNU. Meanwhile, Indo-Guyanese, 40% of the population, descendants of indentured laborers from India, predominantly back the People's Progressive Party, PPP. In 2020, the PPP won a highly contentious general election by a razor-thin margin. Just 2 seats, intensifying tensions. With control over the government, the PPP now holds the power to shape policy, including how oil revenues are distributed. This has sparked concerns from the APNU, which accuses the PPP of favoring Indo-Guyanese while neglecting the interests of Afro-Guyanese and other minority communities. The tension escalated further when the PPP excluded the APNU from the board of the Natural Resource Fund, which manages surplus oil revenues. The APNU argues that this move allows the PPP to redirect funds in a biased manner, favoring their voter base. But are these concerns justified? So far, there is no concrete evidence of discriminatory practices by the PPP. However, the mere perception of injustice is enough to stoke ethnic tensions in Guyana. History shows that ethnic grievances are often magnified during periods of resource abundance, when different groups feel excluded from the benefits. This presents a critical challenge for Guyana. How can it distribute oil revenues in a transparent and equitable manner so that all communities, whether Afro-Guyanese, Indo-Guyanese, or other minorities, feel included? Failure to do so could see ethnic tensions erupt into conflict, jeopardizing the country's stability. One of the greatest challenges Guyana faces is climate change. With much of its terrain consisting of low-lying coastal areas, the country is highly vulnerable to flooding. The capital, Georgetown, home to a significant portion of the population, even lies below sea level. For years, seawalls have shielded residents from the relentless ocean, but things are changing. Rising sea levels are making floods more frequent and severe. Crops have been destroyed. Seawater occasionally breaches the barriers. And, by some estimates, Georgetown could be underwater in less than a decade. The question is oil drilling, an activity that accelerates climate change, worth the risk? Guyana's offshore deepwater drilling not only contributes to global warming, but also poses the threat of oil spills. If a spill were to occur, The resulting catastrophe could cause irreparable harm to biodiversity in a country where 85% of the land is covered by rainforests. Fisheries, a primary source of protein for many Guyanese, would be devastated, especially for indigenous communities that rely heavily on natural resources. The dilemma is compounded by Guyana's history of climate action. For years, the country received funding from Norway to preserve its rainforests, a model once hailed for its potential. But the reality is that the funds generated through such initiatives have fallen short. For instance, over a decade, Guyana received $150 million from Norway to keep its oil reserves untapped. Yet in just 1 year, oil revenues have already exceeded that amount by more than double. Globally, climate funding commitments often remain unmet. The Paris Agreement's promise of $100 billion for vulnerable nations has largely failed to materialize, leaving countries like Guyana without sufficient resources to combat climate impacts. While oil drilling contributes to global warming, Guyana's Environmental Protection Agency reports that the country remains carbon negative due to its rainforests absorbing more CO2 than it emits. This reality has paradoxically led the Guyanese government to integrate oil extraction into its climate strategy. Oil revenues could fund seawall upgrades, support farmers dealing with floods, and invest in climate-resilient infrastructure. Guyana now stands at a crossroads. Exploit its black gold to secure its future, or leave it untouched to preserve its status as the green lungs of the planet. This is not merely an economic question, but a profound ethical and global responsibility. Guyanese people understand this complexity, but in a world where climate justice is far from equitable, they find themselves compelled to prioritize national interests above all else. Despite the significant concerns surrounding Guyana's emergence as a new oil power, hope remains for the nation if it adopts strategic reinvestment measures to ensure a more sustainable future. At the heart of this strategy lies the reinvestment of oil revenues to not only improve livelihoods, but also build a stronger, diversified economy that can thrive even after oil resources are depleted. First, Guyana can use its oil profits to fund essential infrastructure projects, including healthcare, education, transportation, and climate resilience initiatives. These projects not only enhance the quality of life, but also reduce dependency on the oil industry. Promising progress is already underway. The country is constructing 12 hospitals, numerous schools, 7 hotels, 2 major highways, its first deepwater port, and a large gas-to-energy plant that will double Guyana's energy output while halving electricity costs. These initiatives should be expanded and prioritized, particularly those addressing rising sea levels and mitigating the impacts of climate change. The second strategy involves establishing and managing sovereign wealth funds to ensure the efficient use of oil revenues. Such funds offer 2 key advantages. First, transparent fund management can curb corruption and allow citizens to monitor how resources are allocated. Second, sovereign wealth funds enable diversified investments, fostering a resilient economy less dependent on oil revenues. Guyana could draw lessons from Norway's success, which boasts a sovereign wealth fund valued at over $1.4 trillion. This fund not only supports world-class social welfare policies, but also shields the nation's economy from market volatility. Guyana has taken steps in this direction by creating its own natural resource fund, NRF. However, its management under a single political party has sparked internal tensions. Nevertheless, this marks a positive step forward. While Guyana has made commendable progress, the journey toward building a new sustainable nation remains long and fraught with challenges. Risks such as the resource curse, Dutch disease, unequal wealth distribution, and environmental threats persist as looming concerns. However, it is undeniable that Guyana has won the oil lottery and now stands at a historic crossroads, an opportunity to transform its newfound wealth into a powerful tool for poverty alleviation and long-term prosperity. The promise of a golden future is still within reach. If the government and the people of Guyana act wisely, implement the right measures, and remain committed to sustainable development, the nation's potential can be realized. not just for today, but for generations to come. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to our channel to motivate us to create more fascinating content. Goodbye, and see you next time.